Okay. Well, this is so very exciting, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Um, my name, once again, is Kenan Scott, pronouns he and him, his, and I would like to make sure that we are all in agreement that tonight we are here to have an open discussion. We are here to have a wonderful guest, and we are here to celebrate community. I am here representing Redwood Heights Association. We are a neighborhood group. We are here to build community, and we do this in many various ways. We have one of our major projects, which is Love Your Park. That is a project to revitalize the Redwood Heights Park that is right on the corner of 35th and Aliso. If you have kids, you may know it very well from our time spent at the Rocket Summer Camp or after school and at the playground. We know that it needs support. It needs love, it needs community in order to make that happen. So we are a group that is, with our focus this year being primarily on how do we work together in community with the city to revitalize that park. So if you'd like to join us on that or any of our other missions to build community, to empower youth and to come together, please join us. We have monthly meetings. We have a wonderful website. I'll put the link in the chat, as well as our info at Redwood Heights email address. I will also throw in the chat. Please feel free to volunteer, whether that be your time, your thoughts, or some money to help us along the way towards our goals of revitalizing the Redwood Heights Park, as well as many other projects like the 39th Street Garden. I don't know if you've ever been by there, but it is a beautiful oasis right at the top of a wonderful view. So we definitely enjoy our community and would love your support in doing so. Tonight, we have a wonderful guest with us. I am so very happy and very excited to have Darlene Flynn. Darlene Flynn has been the director of the Department of Race and Equity for the city of Oakland since 2016. She came to our city with over a decade of experience as one of the original architects of the now nationally recognized model Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative. So I think we already understand from that name that we're going to have a wonderful discussion tonight. As the leader of a small but mighty team of 3 here in Oakland, she is working to implement the equity mission of the city to intentionally and integrate on a citywide basis the principles of fair and just in all the things the city does to achieve equitable opportunities for all people and communities. I take a pause and I want to recognize the incredible task that you have set on and the wonderful impact that your work has and will continue to have in Oakland. So ladies and gentlemen, people and pals, my friends, family, and parents of the community, I would like to introduce you to Darlene Flynn. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you. Hi, Mary. And Jenny is here. I lived in Redwood in your catchment area for a while in the Maple. So I'm feeling like I'm sort of returning to my group. I was on the you know the what's it called, neighborhood application at that time. And of course, when I moved, I had to leave and join a different one. So it's good to be back. I feel like I'm returning back to my old neighborhood. And I feel so honored to have been asked to come here. I have to say, for those of you who have had to sit through my presentations before, that it may be a little bit, you may recognize some of these slides. I'm going to use a PowerPoint deck because it keeps me on track. It enables me to go a little bit faster. There's a lot of material here. We may not get through all of it. That's okay, because there's always future conversations and we will get through plenty of it. I'm sure of that. And what I'm hoping to do is reserve enough time at the end that we can have some question and answer. So I want to get through the material and then we can talk. I don't always train that way. I have culled through my training slides to pull this presentation together, and I oftentimes have a lot of interaction built in, but because of time, that makes a longer session. We're going to save the interaction for the end. And just know that what I'm doing is giving you a peek into the work that we are doing inside the city. And I think I've found that that's the best way to talk about the Department of Race and Equity and the work that we're doing. If I try to describe it as I used to in the early days in the abstract, it's often doesn't make sense because there's a lot to it. But when I walk through some of the training slides that we use, at least you will get insight into how we're approaching this very important work. And you're right, it's a daunting task and mission that we've taken on. But I'm really excited and have been since I got here to be in Oakland, to bring here the technology that we developed in Seattle and to modify it. We're growing it here too, because Oakland is a different environment. It's a very enlivened environment around issues of race and justice and always has been. As a matter of fact, there's a very strong connection between Seattle, Washington and Oakland, California that goes back to the Black Panthers. And it's the reason why when they contacted me and asked me if I would consider, if I'd be willing to consider coming to Oakland, I said yes, because I already knew a little bit about the history of justice work in the city of Oakland, because the city of Seattle had the first chapter of the Black Panthers outside of Oakland, California. A lot of the leadership, the Black leadership from Seattle came down to Oakland, and we're very excited to start a chapter in Seattle. And so some of my teachers in the early days of my raising my racial consciousness and awareness of how systemic racism works, I got to know some of those early Seattle Black Panthers, and some of them are my friends to this day. So I know that at the time that the Panthers were first founded, they were considered very radical. But if you want to have a kind of a fun revelation, you should Google their 10-point plan that they put together back in the day when they were considered oh so radical. And there were other reasons why they were radical. But if you look at what they stood for and what they were trying to achieve, it is almost exactly what we are working on now. It has not changed very much. We still have a lot of the same problems and a lot of the same issues. I'm trying to hide those controls. There we go. So many things to fix. And we are still trying to peel that onion. We are still trying to get at some of those issues that caused the Black Panthers and other activists of that time, not everyone was a Black Panther, other civil rights movement makers to rise up. And we did make progress as a result of the civil rights movement. We've made some progress, but what we know is that we don't yet have a world that we should be satisfied with passing on to the next generation. We know it's not right deep in our hearts and maybe in our gut, and maybe we even know it in our head. The tricky part is figuring out how we make this difference so that we can pass on something different to future generations. So I'm really lucky that the city of Oakland passed an ordinance, which is rare. I want you to know that I don't know of any other city in the country. Again, even though this work started in Seattle, it took Oakland to put it on another level in a certain way. And that was that in Oakland, they started this work by passing an ordinance, which means that this race and equity work is part of city law. It is part of city code. It is now codified as part of the city code. And Seattle still has not actually codified their initiative as part of law in the city of Seattle. I think they will get to it. They just went about it differently. We were figuring it out. We felt our way into it differently. So when the city of Oakland decided to take action on this, the city council picked it up where the city of Seattle left off and said, we're going to adopt this right up front as law in the city of Oakland. So that's pretty exciting. And it's not something that makes things change all by itself, but it gives us a very strong platform from which we can operate to do this work. And I can always fall back on it and say, I know this is hard and we have a lot to learn about how to get it right, but we have a lot of authorization to do that work, to figure it out, to work hard, to struggle, even to make mistakes, if that's what it takes, in order to do the work that the city has given us to do. So I feel very lucky to be part of that and being the person that got to stand up the office here. I'm still excited about it after over 4 years. So we often start these sessions by centering ourselves in some of the earliest history of the state of California, having to do with the first people that lived on this land. So obviously Oakland and all the rest of California is on occupied indigenous land. And the group, the tribal group that whose land Oakland sits on are called the Ohlone. That's what they're called now, and that's what we call them. And they're part of a larger group called the Coastal Miwok, which has actually had groups of villages all around the bay. and beyond, as you can see down there in the lower right-hand corner. And whenever I go to a new place in this country, I always look up this information, whose land, and the question that I hold in my heart is, whose land am I on? And by that, I don't mean who holds the deed of trust or who has the right to control it now. I'm asking that fundamental question that is beneath that. And that question is important to justice, that we understand and know whose land we're on, and that we recognize that the Ohlone are still among us. Some of these groups have fewer or maybe even no representatives left because of complete genocide of their group through policy decisions that were made by the United States and others to do what it took to take the land. So you can see up in the right-hand corner there some of the earliest history of the state, and in fact, the rest of the country. It's not unique to California at all. It's just important for us to know that it happened here too, was the removal of indigenous people in various ways. They're to be held in our hearts because often this is the most invisibilized group, a racial group, and there's often not very much data about the group for all kinds of reasons. And so we center groups that are most dramatically underrepresented or impacted by racial disparities in doing this work, and that would include indigenous people among us and before us. And with gratitude, I recognize their stewardship. That meant that when these things happened, they were turning over land that had been maintained in a very pristine and stewardship manner. And we can all be grateful for what is left of the beauty that had been preserved for millennium before contact with Western explorers and ultimately the United States government. So having said all that, I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm not holding anybody in this room responsible for that because none of us were there. We weren't there now. We weren't there then, but we are here now. And so what we do when we're doing this work in the city is we center ourselves also on the fact that this can be blame-free because we actually know what happened and we know who did it. It's no longer mysterious, even though we weren't necessarily taught that in school. Most of us did not get that as part of our basic education. That doesn't mean that we don't know. We do know. And in this information age, we can go as deep as we want to go on that history. It's all around us. And we can learn what we didn't learn in school. So we can only be blamed for whether or not we take responsibility for the page of history that's being written now. We can't do anything about the history that happened before we got here, but we need to understand it because by understanding what happened before, we can draw the corollaries between that and what's happening now and learn the lessons from that and do something different now to write a different kind of history for those future generations. I don't know if that makes sense, but we use history to understand what happened then to help us understand what we need to be focusing on now to make it right. So we can pass on to the next generation a better world when it comes to race and justice. So it requires an open mind and critical thinking. And then I pledge, my department pledges, and the three of us work as hard as we can to give people all the support that they need to really understand this deeply and to mobilize for change. And that's what these sessions are about. That's what we're focusing on. This is a video by one of my heroes. His name is Bryan Stevenson. If you don't know about Bryan, this should send you on your journey when you get to hear him here. And it may or may not play. I'm just going to be completely honest. I know how to make it if I have to. I will go out of this view because I really love him. And if you don't know him, I want you to meet him. This is a good way. It will usually play in this view. So let me see if that works.
Finally, another in our brief but spectacular series. Tonight, attorney Bryan Stevenson, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform, shares his thoughts on race and the legal system.
I was doing a hearing in the Midwest. I had my suit and tie on. I was there early. It was the first time I'd been in that courtroom. And I sat down at defense counsel's table, as I always do, and the judge walked in, and the judge said, hey, you get back out there and you wait out there in the hallway until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it that when this judge saw a middle-aged black man, it didn't even occur to him that that man sitting at defense counsel's table was the lawyer. And I worry about that judge. I worry that he's sentencing defendants of color more harshly. I worry that he doesn't value and accept the testimony of Black and brown witnesses the way he does other people, I worry that a narrative of racial difference compromises his ability to provide fair and just treatment of all people. I don't think we're free in America. I think we are burdened by our history of racial inequality. We have a history of horrific mistreatment of people based on color. And I think that narrative of racial difference that was cultivated to justify that mistreatment has created a kind of smog, and we've all been breathing it in. If you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It doesn't talk about ideologies of white supremacy. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor, and because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. We had decades of terrorism and violence where Black people were pulled out of their homes, burned alive, hung, beaten to death, sometimes literally on the courthouse lawn, and we never talked about that. And then we had this era of civil rights resistance to racial segregation, and we've made progress, but we haven't confronted the narrative of racial difference. Unlike South Africa, where you are required to hear about the damage done by apartheid. Unlike Germany, in Berlin, Germany, you can't go 100 meters without seeing markers or stones or monuments placed near the homes of Jewish families abducted during the Holocaust. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation, and our silence has condemned us. When I went to Harvard Law School my first year, I didn't want people to know I started my education in a colored school. I didn't want them to know I was the great-grandson of enslaved people. I thought it might diminish me. And then I realized that my power, if I have any, my strength, if I have any, my insight, if I have any, was shaped by those people who survived slavery. And it's in that story of survival that I think we have some greatness that we can offer, and not just people of color, but all of us who have learned to overcome. My name is Bryan Stevenson, and this is my brief but spectacular take on justice in America.
And you can watch additional episodes of
So what I love about the way Bryan Stevenson approaches this work is his never-ending hopelessness or hopefulness in the face of some very hopeless clients that he works with, to try to overturn children who've received life sentences in kangaroo courts in the South. That's what he spends his time in. Children who are incarcerated with adults and traumatized in that experience, physically and mentally. And he sits with those clients day in and day out, but still had energy to go on and create a lynching museum that we can all go and learn in. And I think that that kind of ability to see beyond the trauma and the uncomfortable pain of racism and the history of racism in this country, to be activated to continue to work against it, is an amazing thing, and it's something I aspire to, and in a way embody. But I always like to notice who's in the water with me, and I can always remember that Bryan Stevenson is in the water with me, and he's an amazing force for good in this country. But he points out to us that our inability to confront these issues and to heal from them is holding us back. It is condemning us to these repeated cycles of civil unrest and painful events repeating themselves, really history repeating itself in many ways, because we have yet to thoroughly undo it. So he also challenges us to rise to the occasion, and he just has the perfect balance. So I wanted to share that with you and use that as a launching pad for the rest of this conversation. So what does that mean for us here in Oakland, and what will we do about it? We know that this work has been evolving over my lifetime, because diversity work was started in about the time that I entered the workforce. So this little trajectory, this little continuum represents my career. First diversity, then inclusion, and then equity and justice. And we couldn't be doing equity and justice if we hadn't done diversity and inclusion, but it is not the same thing. It is not the same thing. Diversity is about colorizing the room. The world was already diverse, but there were many, many spaces and places, and still are spaces and places in this country that are not yet diverse. So we have to make the inside of our organization look like the outside of our organization. That's diversity. But that's really about individual people coming into the organization. Then inclusion is about the experience that they're having once they get there. What's happening with them? How is it going? And we have to do a lot of work about that. That's inclusion. And we're looking at participation across identities and cultures. And we might be looking at language access and those kinds of things, inclusive actions and behaviors. But equity is a different thing. And so we differentiate so that as I train people up or tool people up in the city, I'm letting them know that we're going to another level here. So fasten your seatbelt and put on your big boy and big girl pants, because we're going for justice. And justice is when the outcomes match the intentions. When whatever the intentions were behind diversity and inclusion actually become real outcomes in people's lives, and they are actually experiencing justice on a day-to-day basis, both inside the institution and outside the institution. And so justice is another layer of the onion, if you will. And we couldn't get to this layer if we hadn't done the other layers, but the other layers are not sufficient. And so my job is, I've never done D&I work. I'm going to confess, I entered this work at the equity stage in Seattle. I had been through many diversity and inclusion processes in my career, but not leading them. I got to come in for this part, and I feel very lucky because I've now had a 15-year career studying advancing equity and justice in an institutional setting. So that's what I'm talking to you about. So we know that we need a vision. Every good change initiative, every meaningful change activity has a vision, something that it's going for that is somewhat beyond our immediate grasp. And that vision for the Race and Social Justice, or the Race and Equity Initiative in Oakland, is to create a city where racial disparities have been eliminated and racial equity has been achieved. And I don't have the slide in here that defines racial disparities, but for those of you who've looked at our our equity indicator report, we put together a set of disparity data that shows how different groups racially are faring in the city of Oakland in key life outcome intersections. And what it shows is that based on race, it is very predictable in Oakland and in every other city in this country, really, that different groups of people are going to be faring very, very differently. That's one of the ways that we know that this is a systemic problem. If it weren't a systemic problem, every place you went would be different. But in fact, when it comes to race, every place you go is pretty much the same. There are regional flavors to it. The flavor in Seattle is a little different than the flavor in Oakland. But when you dig underneath that, veneer on top, you find the same stuff going on. And that's because it's systemic and it was propagated systemically as the country developed from east to west. And so we know that in order to get at this, we're going to have to start to learn to identify how is it being maintained in city government? How can we identify or learning to identify and how we can eliminate systemic causes of disparities that the city might be causing? And we know that they're there because anytime you look under a rock in the United States, you will find systemic problems or things that are systemically problematic for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's in our DNA. It is everywhere. It's in the dirt. It's like, contamination in the dirt or in the air. Brian Stevenson often, I think he did in that video, refers to it as smog that we all breathe. It's everywhere. But we want to put our finger on it very specifically and figure out how to eliminate those systemic causes of racial disparities that we have control over. We don't have control over everything, but we're going to start with what we do have control over. And then we want to promote inclusion and full participation for all residents of the city. This is not the current condition. This is an aspiration. We are working on it. And it's more related to inclusion than it is to justice, but to the degree that we haven't achieved good inclusion, we're not going to be able to achieve good justice. So we're working on that too. And then finally, we're teaching people to be focused on outcomes and the disparities. The data tells us that our outcomes as yet have not gotten us where we need to be. So we're going to look at how can we reduce those disparities in our communities. In other words, it's not enough for us to just change things inside the city. We want to also be paying attention to whether or not that's changing conditions in the community. And we'll know that because the data will tell us, or the people will tell us. If the data is not telling us, the people will make it clear for us. So either qualitative or quantitative data, we want to make sure that we're having an impact on people's lives and the disparities that they're experiencing. So those are our initial focus areas. We're still working on them. We haven't got all that worked out yet, but we are starting to layer on a little more advanced work. We're still going to have to circle back to this. This work is not linear. It sometimes has fits and starts. It sometimes goes left and right. There's the politics. We all know about that. There's a lot of things the point of having an initiative like this is that we're not going to take our eye off the ball no matter what else happens. We will figure out how to navigate that, even if it's not a straight line. These kinds of focus areas help us do that. Here we go. All right. So what is equity? Equity is not the same as equality. The civil rights movement was very much about equal treatment under the law, because up until that time, which by the way, was within my lifetime, so it was not long, long ago and far away. It was ways ago. I was a baby, but it was within one lifetime ago. It was completely legal in this country to treat different groups of people overtly differently under the law. And that had catastrophic impacts that set groups of people back permanently or up until today. And that's what we have to work on. So we can't start as though we have a fresh page, because we don't have a fresh page. And if we just start treating people equally now, which many people try to do because they're good people and they want to do that, it's not enough. It's not enough because of the 300 years of history that came before that, that held different groups of people back in many ways. And so we have to acknowledge that and look at equity instead of just equality. Equality is not bad. It just doesn't get us there. All the people in this picture on the left are not getting access. They're not getting good access. They're not getting meaningful access to the resources that they're trying to see over the fence. So we look at this and we say, okay, that means we have to help people differently. We have to support people, sometimes more support in some areas, but more importantly, different support. Support that actually fits the needs, will bump people up and enable them to then be on equal footing, even though the supports are different. It brings them to equal footing with people who have had a less fraught history in the United States. So we want to be real clear about this, because we often rest on this idea, well, I'm treating everyone the same, I'm a good person. We don't discriminate against people based on race, but our outcomes are still very inequitable, and that's because treating everybody the same isn't enough. We want to actually acknowledge that more or different is needed for some groups of people. So equity is fair and just inclusion, and fair and just inclusion means that things are arranged in a way that everyone can prosper. And the goals of equity must be to create those conditions that allow everyone to reach their full potential. And not everybody has the same potential. We understand that. But that potential, it turns out, is not controlled by race. It is controlled more by circumstance. And our circumstances are very racialized in this country. In short, equity creates that pathway, right, from hope and dreams, if you will, and visions to change by focusing on removing barriers and changing systems. It's very concrete. It's also theoretical. It's also, for some people, it's spiritual. It's moral. There's a lot of ways we can talk about it, but we make it as concrete as we possibly can, so that people have that to support them as they're moving forward. We have some guiding principles that keep us on track. We are system focused primarily, less focused, at least on the leading edge, on individuals, and more focused on systems, outcomes, and we use data to drive our path, to set our course. We work to shift people in as many numbers as possible, the most number we can, from gatekeepers who are just tending the status quo to agents of institutional transformation or change agents. And that can happen inside the institution, and it's been happening forever in the community. This is, much of this is borrowed from community organizing theory, that the way we make change happen is through bringing more people into action, into activating for social change. The only difference is we're doing it on the inside, and the community continues to do it on the outside, and that's a good thing. We have inside change agents and we have outside change agents. We don't all do the same thing because we operate differently inside than the community operates outside. That's fine, as long as we're all pointed in the same direction. So we take action, we're action oriented to identify and address institutional elements of racism. You've seen that point before. We work to stay grounded in history and root causes of racial inequity. That's why it's so important to understand why Indigenous people seem to be, in most people's lives, very invisible. They've been invisibilized by the way in which racism has impacted them. And so if we understand that, then it's easier for us to remember to remember them and to include them in the work that needs to be done. And then we have to learn to be more accountable to those who are most impacted by racial disparities. One of the most undermining impacts of racial disparities is that people with that are highly impacted have less social, political, and economic clout in the society. And so it is very easy for institutions and even communities to not be accountable to those groups of people. So we have to face that fact and be intentional about being accountable to groups that are impacted by racial disparities. That doesn't mean that that's the only group we're accountable to, but we make sure that we become accountable to them because the history is to not include them in that way. So that's a big change area for us. We have to add, we're already accountable to multiple audiences. It is another audience that becomes crucial to advancing equity. So it's something we have to work on as a city and as a society. So this whole idea of systemic and institutional racism, I know I'm talking to a pretty sophisticated group here, and you probably got this wrapped, but I never assume, because even as the word is being tossed around more now in the, general population, if you will, even the media is talking about systemic and institutional racism. And trust me, 15 years ago, they were not. You had to go to academics and specialists to have that conversation. So that's progress. The fact that this is making it into our popular lexicon is a good thing, but I'm not sure that means we always really understand it. So I'm going to just do a couple of little slides on it. Institutional and systemic racism. This is Jay Smoot. He's a New Yorker. Yeah, I like him.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, what would you call it if lifetimes of legal segregation, followed by decades of pervasive racist housing policies, still, to this day, disadvantage Black people in every aspect of life? Because where you live can help decide what food you eat, what sort of jobs you can get, how safe you are, what sort of health care you can get, and the quality of your children's education. Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
So Jay Smoot has a whole series of these videos online that he did for Race Forward. And Race Forward is here in Oakland. So one of the things I love about this work is how it's bringing the country together around this theory of action that we're all working on propagating now, that a lot of people are working on. And the fact that you have a New York vlogger and Race Forward in Oakland, California, partnering up to do a series on YouTube about moving the race conversation forward just delights me as an activist and as a change agent myself. So there's a lot more in that. If you go to Race Forward's website, you'll find all kinds of links, or if you go on YouTube and just look for Jay Smoot, you'll find his links. Anyway, the nice thing about him is that he's got these succinct ways of talking about these complex issues. And I always recommend them to my change agents because you can study how other people do it. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. You can actually use work that's been done by other organizations to tune up your own game, if you will. That's how people always learn. They learn from people who've come before them or who have done more than they've done. And there's so much of this great stuff out there now. So systemic and institutionalized racism is basically the identification and acknowledgement of a pattern of social institutions such as government. Yes, we're right out front because we should be. Schools, banks, and courts of law perpetuating negative treatment toward a group of people based on their race. Institutional racism leads to inequality in opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. So we just ground ourselves in this definition and say, that's what we're going to fix. We can't fix all of those institutions, but we can work on government, and that's what we're doing. We have some great working assumptions that help also support people to get out of the racial smog or the racial smog box that they've been given. These working assumptions just kind of rattle at some of the dominant narrative that we might have absorbed over time. First of all, race matters. Almost every indicator of well-being shows troubling disparities by race, and we have a report to prove that about the City of Oakland called the Equity Indicator Report. You can find it linked to the Department of Race and Equity website. Disparities are often created and maintained inadvertently, maybe, or maybe not, through policies and practices that contain barriers to opportunity. And there enters government. We hold a lot of policies. It's possible and only possible to close equity gaps by using strategies determined through an intentional focus on race. This links directly back actually to the first item. If race matters, then we have to deal with race, basically. And so that's what we do. We deal with race. If opportunities in all key areas of well-being are equitable, then equitable results will follow. So this is the litmus test. We wouldn't have racial inequity if we had racial opportunity that was equitable. So as long as we have those racial inequities, we know that there's still work that we have to do upstream on the inputs that are creating the inequities. It's a little bit of a test. Then the last one is my bread and butter, because this is what I get to do all the time, everywhere, 24/7. Given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward racial equity. Now, you may say not everybody will work toward racial equity, and that's true. But the good news is that the study of a system change and social change tells us that we don't need everybody, we just need enough. So our game is building that momentum and enough change agents and enough people actively pushing for the change that we experience the next tipping point of change. And we know it can happen because it's happened lots of other times in our history. And we're just the ones that are up to bat now and figuring out how it needs to happen at this moment, in this time. And particularly in this movement time, I do believe we are experiencing a movement time now again, which tends to happen kind of like clockwork every 25, 30, 40 years. We're back in it. So here we are. And we will keep being thrown back into it until we fix it. So here we are. We start in our process of bringing people into this work, we do spend some time unpacking the racial history of this country that has been withheld from us in our poor educations. And we look at as many of the policies as we can, the easily accessible ones. We certainly don't teach a college course on it. Probably about it. But there's so many examples. It's pretty easy to illustrate this page. I keep finding more great examples and running out of room on this slide. So it's getting very crowded. But over the course of the history of this country, there is not a non-white group that the United States of America hasn't actively done tremendous harm to in various ways. Not the same exact treatment of everyone, but the same exact impacts. And at the time, the impacts were grave and in many cases lasting. So we want to become more familiar with this history because this is kind of the history that the Texas Textbook Depository has weeded out of our history classes. This is the stuff that we didn't get taught and that we have to go look for. Again, the good news is, it seems like about every other month, there's another great academic study published as a great book. And I'm going to talk about a specific one in just a moment that can fill us in. There's so much great information out there, and a lot of it is extremely accessible now in books and also in audiobooks and blogs. And there's just so much stuff. I can't keep up with it. As a practitioner, I'd like to say I'm keeping up with all the latest and greatest. Too much. I'm behind. My stack of unread books is ridiculous because I will buy the book. So to that effect, there is a great book out about redlining, and we spend quite a bit of time in the city of Oakland unpacking redlining. And there's actually a video here that does that. I'm not going to actually show it today. I will tell you how to find it online. It is on YouTube, and you can watch it on your own. It breaks down some of the main elements of redlining. But I really, if social justice is something that you want to have an impact on, this book I think is just seminal. I think it's just really important, and I recommend it to all city employees. Anybody that's in city government needs to read or listen to The Color of Law: A Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America. And Richard Rothstein actually teaches here in the Bay Area sometimes. He's back and forth with the East Coast, but he speaks quite a bit here too. So, and there's great video of him online. There's a lot of way to get at this information, but it really was obscured from us. We know about it in general, but I don't think most of us, without doing some studying, have any idea how profound and lasting the impacts of redlining have been. So the better we understand it, the better we can address the result of it. And if you just look at this redlining map, and I know it's partly obscured because I have this other book sitting on it, you can see how the flatlands of Oakland were all colored in red and yellow. and how the uplands of Oakland were all colored in blue and green. And that just solidified so much public policy that came after that has been profoundly and life-threateningly impactful and continues to have those impacts unto this day. So if you don't know about redlining, it's totally possible for you to know about it. If you do know about it, learn more about it, because I'm going to guess, unless you've already studied, there's more for you to learn. And we use that to help people understand the root causes that cause us problems. And I think what I'll do after this is I will actually just send you this PowerPoint deck too. It'll be a PDF, but I will embed the link for the video that you could see Chris Rock does the opening joke. And you can go and watch that. But I think it doesn't do the whole job. It's just a taste. It's a tease. There's a lot more out there. But the reason we want to understand that so thoroughly is because of our socialization and that racial smog that we've been breathing all our lives. When we look at these racial disparities, this is one of our disparities from the indicator report. And we see these huge disparities. This is one of the most just enormous disparities between African Americans and all other groups. But particularly if you look at the difference between African American and white, asthma-related ER visits for children under the age of 5, this just takes my breath away, and I don't have asthma. But it's just unbelievable. And when we look at disparities like this, we want to understand these disparities through this lens, not through the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative will cause us to draw racist conclusions about these disparities. That is deeply problematic. So the other thing we do is we spend quite a bit of time unpacking the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative says that this is all about winners and losers. Yes, that's right. If you have a sick child, you're a loser. Personal merit or deficit. People get what they deserve. And this is all backed up with highly racialized assumptions. And another way of saying, a less circumspect way of saying highly racialized assumptions is racist ideas about people. And the problem with that, according to John A. Powell, who's now here at Berkeley, and he's another one of my inspires. He's written a book also that's really good, but he also has done a lot of research about opportunity and the impact of opportunity on outcomes. The problem with this narrative is that it leads to no change, besides the fact that it's kind of racist, or maybe a lot racist, when you dig down into it. It also demobilizes people because it doesn't look like there's anything that we collectively need to do. It's all about individualism and individuals, and therefore the rest of us are off the hook. And I would argue to you that that is not right. And John has said this narrative will always produce durable, persistent, and racialized poverty built around just accepting and tolerating this societal problem by framing it as an individual issue rather than a systemic issue. So we are asking our city staff to constantly be asking themselves this question, as well as questions about systemic racism in our policies. Where do we see elements of the dominant worldview in ourselves and in our work? Because we want to contradict that and root it out to the best of our ability, because it gets in our way of making change. Again, not as a judgment, but as a barrier to justice. We have to root it out in order to get to justice. So what we do is we intentionally replace it with a narrative that will advance equity, with information, with knowledge that is true and real, and that needs to be considered when we're thinking about those disparities. First of all, the individual develops in the context of access to opportunity. That's just true. That's a developmental fact. Government has a role in addressing structural barriers. This is another problem we have to address, because government had a lot to do with creating this construct that has made enduring differences in access to opportunity. We have to replace community marginalization with community agency. And they were marginalized by society, and therefore it's society's responsibility to get the marginalization out of the way so that they can reclaim their agency. Marginalized groups, Black, Indigenous, people of color, any other oppressed group in this country have always had agency and have always fought for our own liberation. But we need folks to get out of the way of that. Basically, we need government and others to get out of the way of exercising that agency. And then community involved solutions are critical. They're necessary to transformation because it is the communities that are oppressed or are marginalized or are impacted by racial disparities that have the best view of the problem. They don't have everything they need. We have a lot of expertise that we need to bring to the table. We, the city, now I'm talking about we, the city, but it might be you as a community member. We have a lot of expertise that we can bring to the matter, but we are going to be missing, we're likely to be missing some very important information that the community that is impacted by those disparities has that we don't. So where do we see elements of equity frame in our work, and how can we build on that and make it better? And the reason we want to do that is for the sake of transformation. And the reason we want transformation is for the sake of liberty and justice for all. Hardly a radical idea or a new idea. It is new in a nuanced way. And that is that now in 2021, we mean all, not just some. And of course, when the founding fathers penned those words, they were not defining all as all. They really had a particular group more in mind. So, but we understand and believe that the sentiment is important and motivating, and we want to become the country that we always said we were going to be. And that's our page of history to work on, moving closer to that, closer to that. We may not completely achieve it in our lifetimes, but we want to move the ball down the field. So the other way that I give people to think about and talk about this is imagine that workshops have been prepared for people to build their life in. And for some people, people in those green and blue parts of the country, it's not just Oakland, it's also all major metropolitan areas, and not so major, some of them, have been redlined. And by redlining and all the subsequent policy decisions that followed, we created very high opportunity workshops for some groups of people. It's where all the money and the resources ended up, a lot of it in the suburbs as well. But either in the red and green, the green and blue parts of cities and the suburbs is where these high opportunity workshops are. And Black, Indigenous people of color were not allowed to move there, even if they were economically able. And so that gave that group of people a huge leg up. The creation of the suburbs and the 40-year mortgage and access to that mortgage by white people, white veterans coming back from World War II, et cetera, built the middle class, built the white middle class. If it had not been for those policies and those subsidies that were provided by the government to that specific group of people, they would not have had this either. But they did get it, and I'm not trying to take it away from them. I'm just trying to get it for everybody else too. Because what was created for Black, Indigenous, and people of color was a workshop that was more like this. And not only is this going to be a very difficult place to build a great life, it's likely to damage you and harm you in the process if you're not very, very vigilant and very, very careful. Now, there are people who manage to do that, but obviously the odds of that happening are much different in this environment than the odds of that happening in this environment. So it doesn't guarantee the outcome, and yet it directs the outcome in very strong and meaningful ways. So in the city, we are focusing on how do we create equity for all, opportunity for all, and this is the tricky part, without displacing the people that have already been harmed by these harmful environments. We have to be very serious about that. We've already seen a huge amount of displacement in the city of Oakland through gentrification. And areas of the city that used to look like this are starting to look more like this, but now they're also not diverse. So that is not the way to fix the problem. We want to fix the problem for everybody. And that's a little trickier. So the narrative that comes out of this is that somehow or another, the people that are born into this environment created this environment for themselves. And that's a very dangerous narrative. And it's also not true, not in any way true. This environment was shaped by public policy and by private sector action, and it has been sustained for a long time. So we just have to be crystal clear about that and challenge any thinking or confusion that is out there. And there's a lot of confusion. So not saying people are bad if they're confused. We just have to let people know when they're confused and help them get unconfused. Another big issue, and I think I will play this because the other reason we're confused about this is that we've been taught that somehow or another white is better. We've been taught that this is somehow genetic, that, you know, where white men can't jump, they are better at everything else, right? It's in our culture. We don't consciously agree with it, but it is so in our culture. And here's where it comes from. So this is Vox on Debunking Race and Bad Race Science.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So this is what we mean when we say race is a construct. It was made up to justify social economic goals. Throughout the history of this country and elsewhere as well, it bounced back and forth between actually the United States and Nazi Germany was a very active period of using a racial construct to commit genocide and other horrific acts. So I think that this is our history and it's bunk, but it's important for us to acknowledge that we have deeply internalized this idea that some races are better at some things than others, and it is simply scientifically not true. There is no correlation between ability and skin color, or hair shape, or eye shape, or any other ways that we recognize race. There is no correlation between those things and ability. What there is a correlation between is race and opportunity. What kinds of opportunities are available to people of different races varies wildly in this country. So it's important for us to also hold this. A lot to think about, huh? There's another video I'm just going to refer you to. You can check this out from the library. I strongly recommend it. Race, the Power, and Illusion. It's a 3-part, about 3 hours to watch the whole thing, but it comes in 3 segments. Race, the Power, and Illusion breaks down the history of how race developed and when and where it developed. There's also a book that's newer by Ibram X. Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning that goes even harder at it. And Ibram Kendi is getting a lot of notoriety right now. He's going to start an institute to study this further. So his book, Stamped from the Beginning, also Race, the Power of an Illusion, if you want to delve more deeply into these issues of the science of race versus the social construct of race. Another very interesting issue or area. So we're just about done. And then you can ask me questions. The point of this is, at the end of the day, we don't just want to tell a different version of the same story. We actually want to change the whole dang story. And why? Because we have to, if we want to get to a different place. If we don't change the story that we tell each other and ourselves and our political leaders, if we don't learn to differentiate between good information that they are dishing out or bad information that they're dishing out, we are condemned, as Bryan Stevenson said, we are condemned to be plagued by the racial harm and racial trauma that we're living with without acknowledging. Just a couple of last things, because I want you to be prepared with as much stuff as possible. That there's also a really strong business case. So oftentimes about now, what comes up in people's minds, I'm anticipating, it might not be in your mind, but it's in somebody's mind. It's like, isn't this going to be super expensive to fix? And the answer is yes, it is. And but not more expensive than it should be, because the reason that this country is so wealthy is all the wealth that we've extracted from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It has been directly extracted from those groups and put into other people's pockets. And so that's okay. That's what happened. We didn't do it. It happened before we got here. Most of it happened before we got here. I know there's been some recent rounds, but a lot of it got set up a long time ago. So the point is that, yes, it's going to be expensive. And it turns out that racial inequity is also expensive. So one study that was done, sponsored by Kellogg Foundation, it focuses on Michigan, but it would work anywhere. That happens to be where they are, is in Michigan, Kellogg. And so what they found is that by 2050, our country stands to realize $8 trillion gain in GDP by closing the US racial equity gap. Well, we haven't done that, and maybe we won't. But if we did, we would gain $8 trillion in the GDP. Further, federal tax revenue would increase by $450 billion, and state and local tax revenues would increase by $100 billion annually. This is particularly important to an economy like ours, where we are now competing globally with countries that have lower costs for competing. And so we need all the GDP we can get to be competitive on that global stage as well. So the long and the short of this is, if we actually got serious about this and invested the way that we should, we could close the equity gap by 2050. That's actually possible with the appropriate investments. And so it would cost us money between now and then, but then it would be nothing but gravy forever. Because just like poor white people were able to lift themselves up into the middle class with enough subsidy from the federal government, so too can Black, Indigenous, and people of color lift themselves up with adequate investment and support from the government and elsewhere. It doesn't all have to come from the government. So there is a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow for the US economy. And they are not the only ones that have done this kind of work. Our own Policy Link, yeah. Oh, before, when I was saying Policy Link, I should have been saying Race Forward. I'm sorry. Policy Link is also here in Oakland. And this is a quick vid. Oh, I'm going to stop here. You don't need to see this video, but just know that we have people in this city that are doing similar things, and you can go to their website and look at their equity atlas for Policy Link, located here in Oakland, who have also looked at the economic side of creating equity in our society. And I will stop there. There's just so much great energy and opportunity in this. I hope that this has fired you up a little bit, and I'm going to stop sharing now and answer questions or take comments.
Oh, thank you so much. I think everybody, let's just take a moment, take a breath, take a pause, soak in the wealth of information that we just got. I know there were definitely some questions coming up in the chat that I do want to make sure we have a chance to address. Yes, definitely. Thank you to you, Darlene Flynn, for gracing us with that information. And I do want to give a shout out to Policy Link. As you said earlier, we all have to start believing in ourselves as upstreamists and trying to figure out where the problems are being created and not just watching them flow by us and trying to stop them as they come by, but really going upstream and seeing who's throwing these babies in the water. It's probably my favorite upstreamist example. But
where are those babies? How are those babies getting in the water?
Like,
what's going on?
Babies in the water? Why are we standing here with babies drowning in the water? So
I love that metaphor too. I often tell that story.
I did hear one question, and I know there were people that wanted to raise it. If you do want to ask a question, I think we do have the ability for reaction, so you can raise your hand. You can also, I think we ask that if you're gonna unmute yourself, give yourself a moment to let everybody else speak and ask a question before doing so. I know there was a particular question about examples, and there were two people that asked it. I don't know if one of you want to raise your hand to ask that question. Give it a moment. I think it was Michael and Cornelia were asking a question about this. All right, I got a grid full of people. I don't see any hands up, but I'm going to keep us moving. The question was, and it's for you, Darlene, what is an example of one of these interventions that you personally are either working with, towards, battling and conquering, or are you really passionate about as it pertains to your work with the city of Oakland?
Well, there's some pretty exciting developments in the city. The thing that comes to mind right away is how we're approaching the development of our capital improvement program. And the reason I like that is because it is again very concrete, literally. Capital improvement is concrete and asphalt and buildings and so on. And because it's something that almost all cities are very loosey-goosey about. And people wonder, how does this project get done and that project doesn't get done? I mean, it's a constant conversation. And most cities can't even explain it because it's kind of this organic, weird, messy, basically whoever's got the ear of the decision makers gets their stuff in there. Or if something is needed because it's a health and safety issue, or, there's a lot of ways that things get into the capital improvement plan. But in the last budget round, our Public Works Department and our Transportation Department, who hold most of the public works activity in the city, decided through some internal leadership, we have equity teams in those departments, and particularly the Transportation Equity Team is super mature now. It's been going strong for a few years. And so a while ago, they said, I think we need to develop a better way of putting together our capital improvement program that represents our equity values and isn't so vague and opaque and mysterious and frustrating. So they invented, through a lot of hard work, they worked for months on it, a methodology of doing two things. One, collecting potential projects to be considered for the CIP plan so that you didn't need to know the secret handshake. There's a literal portal that you can put it in. So developing that, and then developing a methodology for ranking those projects based on key issues, key matters pertaining to capital improvements. So you do have things in there like health and safety. You have things in, you have all kinds of things, and projects basically accumulate points based on how they relate to these criteria. And two of the criteria are equity criteria. And one of the equity criteria is geographic. Why would we have a geographic criteria? Well, look at the redlining map. That's why, because that's where you will find the crummiest infrastructure. In the red and yellow parts of the city is where the infrastructure is the worst, where the parks are the most dilapidated, where the community centers are terrible, and falling down, or even the fire stations are falling down. I mean, all kinds of things are falling down. And so because redlining drove resources into some areas and away from other areas for now 50, 60 years, right? So it brings that in, it brings that geography impact in. And then the other thing is, who is it going to serve? Is it going to serve communities that are impacted by other racial disparities or biracial disparities? So a project can get extra points for equity, but they can get points in other ways too. There's lots of other ways that they rack up points, but equity is not left out. Equity is part of that conversation. And it resulted in a CIP in the last budget that we're coming to the end of now that looked quite a bit more equitable and much more intentional, more importantly. because it's that intention, because most people in the city want to do the right thing, but they don't have a good way to they don't have an intentional way to do the right thing. And so it just turns out however it turns out. And we just go, we don't know how that happened. We didn't mean it. We didn't want it to be like that. I don't know. It just happened. And so now we can say, this is how it happened. This is why we have this list and not that list. It's based on these criteria and these conversations. And it worked pretty well last time. And this time it's going to work even better because we got a better running start at it. So the staff, a lot of the same staff are working on it this time. And they started earlier and they did more outreach into the community. And we're going to have a really vibrant capital improvement plan, again, that is going to be made up of things that have been intentionally thought through in a very disciplined way. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. And we know that there's some flaws in it, and we know that we want to make it even better, but we're working on those flaws one at a time. And one of them was having enough time to reach hard to reach communities. And we worked on that this time, and we'll keep working on it until it's exactly the way we want it, but it's already better. And it held together through the political process. I'm going to be real transparent with you. This is a place where we do the work, we do the analysis, we the staff, that's me and them and the departments, but then it eventually has to be approved by the mayor and the city council, right? And they actually have the authority and the power to undo all that good work, and they didn't. And that was super exciting. They did some tweaking around the edges because, they're elected to do that, and I'm not mad at them about it. But in general, the process and the learning from it held together, and we're going to be able to build on it this time too. And so we're learning together what it means to flow in a more equitable way. And everybody has to come at it from where they're at. And elected officials have different motivators. Sometimes I started my career in the public sector working for a city council member. So I actually really understand what's going on over there, where the sausage is being made, because I worked in that environment for 8 years. That was my indoctrination into public sector. Hi, Mary. I see you up there. I just noticed your picture's now on my screen. So we have this ability to learn into doing it differently, but we have a lot of history that we have to sort of live out of. So everyone's learning. We're all learning together.
That's wonderful. I want to thank you for that answer, because I think it hit on a couple really, really salient points, of really strong changes which involve equity at the forefront, which is how you gathered information. So can you answer one question for me and for potentially some of my my neighbors and community members, which I know are very much about action. Every time we have one of these meetings, there's definitely a question about like, how do we, and so I'm just wondering, what was the mechanism that you guys used to get input or information for the CIP, and how is there a way to provide feedback or additional input as a community member?
Yes, there definitely is. There's a portal that's online, for one thing. There are leaders in the department of public works, particularly. Sean Mayer is the public information officer. He's a great source of information. If you can't, if the system stuff is too overwhelming, there are people in the department that will help you. Jackie Lorenzar in my department is still working with those folks, so we can be an information point to point people about how to get involved. And they did a lot of community meetings this time, even under COVID. They did a lot of Zoom meetings. And what they basically did was reach out to grassroots organizations and have conversations with the grassroots organizations so that they could reach out to their members or their volunteers or whatever. So they kind of pushed it out through grassroots organizations, and they focused on the areas of the city that weren't represented last time. So they didn't necessarily hit the whole city, but for this next round, they looked at the map after it was all done last time and said, what areas did we not get any projects from? Who did we not hear from? And then they focused in on those areas, and they did really concentrated outreach to them. But it's not restricted to those folks. It's very visible now, and it's very online. So you can find this on the city website. You can see how to enter a project. And if you need technical assistance, there are people in the department that can talk to you. Yeah.
Tremendous. I shared a link in the chat for everyone who wants to see the CIP, and it has more information in terms of, documents, fact sheets, proposals, budget fact sheets as well. So do check that out if you are interested. I'm going to quiet myself and leave this space open for anyone who wants to jump in with any additional questions before we start to close out tonight's session. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and this has been tremendous. So let me just be quiet for a second.
Can I just say something about action? And I always want to stop short of telling community what to do, because I really think it's important that community find its legs. I'm doing internal work, you guys are doing the external work, but getting behind those equity strategies so that if the council members start to wobble because they're feeling political pressure, one of the things you can always do is come in and support that equity work at budget time. Say, yes, no, stay strong, do the right thing, approve this CIP. This is good. We need to hear more sort of positivity from the community about what we're doing. And elected officials particularly need to hear that, because they're always nervous. That's what it means to be an elected official. If any of you have ever tried it, it's not easy, because there's always somebody coming for you, right? And so if they hear from people who believe in what we're doing and who support what we're doing, that's actually helpful to our work. I'm not saying to do that if you don't feel it, but if you feel it, it's kind of like, if you see something, say something. If you feel something, say something. If you feel good about this, let the council know you feel good about this. Yeah, that is so. Anybody else? I'll shut up now. It's been really fun. Thank you all for giving me all this time. And I'll come back too. So it's not like you only get one bite. If you guys get into something, if you choose something you want to focus on and you want to go deeper on any of this stuff, or you feel like you need to go deeper, let us know. Because we want to support you in your equity journey to the best of our ability. I mean, we're spread pretty thin, but when people decide to take a stand, we want to help in any way we can.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. We did have one more question come in, and I want to make sure since we have the time, I'll let anyone else speak first before I ask this question. We most recently had an opportunity to be guests at Congressman Tao's town hall meeting, where we were talking about public safety, and it was really impressive how we were all, as a community, meaning, like you said, public and private sector, as well as government and community, thinking about the root causes around some of our public safety issues, really starting to look at, jobs, job markets. And then I think what was really profound was starting to talk about our housing challenges. And as you speak about equity, one of the questions that came in was around the unhoused. And is there any work that your department is particularly doing focused around those populations that are living without homes?
Yes. This is something where the progress that we've made during the years that I've been here is real, but woefully insufficient. When I first got here, nobody was talking about this at all. The homeless population was just silently growing. And I came here and I saw it, and I said, what's going on here? And people said, shh. Basically, I'm telling you, that's what they said. They said, we don't have the solution, so we're not talking about it. And I'm happy to report, while this isn't the end game at all, that as a result, I think, of a lot of the equity work that we've done, we are now having a much more rigorous and serious conversation about the homelessness challenge. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is homelessness is highly racialized. 70% of the homeless people are people of color or more, and the majority of those are Black. So this is and it's directly related to economic insecurity that has been created by the history of this country. So when you have profound economic insecurity and you put it together with an overheated real estate market, what do you think is going to happen? Homelessness is going to happen. And we saw it happening, but people were afraid of it. They were afraid of it as a topic. I think we're getting over being afraid of it as a topic, and we're starting to talk about it as a race and justice issue. And that is actually helping it, believe it or not. It seems like that might make it harder, but it's actually making it better, because we're ready now. We've gotten ready for having that conversation. And I got to participate in a study that was done by HUD, Alameda County, and local homeless service providers, where we put an equity lens on homeless services and figured out what the gaps were in homeless services. And you probably already know what the gap is, but the hole is ginormous. The whole is very affordable housing, housing that is affordable at or below 30% of median income in the Bay Area. That's where Black people live. a large number of our Black population in the Bay Area lives below 30% of median income. You can't afford to rent a place, let alone buy a place in the Bay Area. So we need vast quantities. If we really want to solve this problem, we need vast quantities of very affordable housing, not 80% of median income, 30% of median income. If we want to end homelessness, there actually is no other way. And so that's the hard part, is facing that. Then now that we face it and we have a report that documents it, and it's got a great equity study in it, and if you don't have the link, I'll send it to you. I don't have it right at my fingertips. It's a really good report. I'm so proud of it, because they weren't even they didn't know how to do equity, but then they did. They were really brave, and they jumped in with both feet. And the mayor was participating in it. She was part of the leadership of that effort, and she encouraged it and supported it strongly. And supported my office's involvement in it and all that stuff. So we came out with a good product. Now we have to solve the problem. So this is a problem that is deeper than the city of Oakland's pockets. We don't have that kind of money in the city of Oakland, but guess what? We have that kind of money in the state of California. If you don't know, the state of California is the 5th largest economy, brace yourself, in the world. Not in the country, in the world. The state of California is the 5th largest economy in the world. We have the money. We are not the agricultural South. We are not the Rust Belt. There are some parts of the country, of course, they don't have a homelessness problem because their housing is cheap in those parts of the country. But where we have these overheated economies is where we have the most money. It's on the West Coast and the East Coast, right? It's where the money's at. We have the money. We just destroyed the tax structure in California over the last 20 or 30 years. People with money aren't paying taxes. And that means we don't have money to build low-income housing. California used to fund education, fund public education, and state of California used to fund public housing or subsidized housing. But over the last 30 or 40 years, the state of California decided to stop doing that. Then simultaneously, the housing market heated up. So what we're seeing on our streets is exactly what we should have expected to see. There was no other possible outcome. It's like you squeeze the toothpaste tube, it's gonna come out somewhere, right? And so the state of California, I know I'm picking on y'all because I'm a newcomer, but I got to tell you, it's no better in Washington. They're doing the same thing up there. The only thing that's better in Washington is philanthropy is spending a little bit more money in Washington than it is in California, because there's a lot of millionaires up there too. But as far as public policy, it sucks just as bad in Washington State. Washington State doesn't even have a graduated income tax, so don't get me started on my home state. But California basically defunded public just as thoroughly as the federal government tried to do. So the state of California is going to have to decide if it wants to keep looking at homelessness or if it wants to do something about it and pay the freight. It's as simple as that. That's going to take a lot of activism, a lot of political change, and but we can do it because we've got the money. This is a rich, rich, rich state. It is not a poor state. So we just have to stop acting like the state is poor and start realizing that the policies are poor. The tax policy is poor, and it's impoverishing our most vulnerable communities. And by the way, those communities, be they Black or brown in particular, keep this economy humming. Let me finish that story. 5th largest economy in the world, and almost 50% of that economy is agricultural. It used to be more, but we obviously have diversified into tech and so forth. But back in the day, it was more than 50%. So that means that this wealth is on the backs of people that do that work. And we know those are immigrants, right? Many of them undocumented, but some of them documented. Immigrants and Black folks, primarily, doing the low wage work that makes that economy so rich. So it's not a handout, it's reparations. I mean, if you really want to be clear about it, it is giving people back what they are due, because California would not be the 5th largest economy in the world without the cheap labor, without the underpaid labor of its BIPOC communities. So we just got to own it and go, yeah, we can fix that. Not about shame and blame. It's about, we know what we need to do. We're going to do it. So I'll end on that note. And in the meanwhile, we're definitely tuning up our work on homelessness. I mean, I think it's going to get better. as far as we can go. But what we really need to do is fill that hole of affordable housing, and that's going to be expensive. The can has been kicked down the road too long for it to be cheap.
We had one more question, Adrian, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Ms. Darlene Flynn and the Redwood Heights Association for organizing this. I was invited by extension of Mary Gregory by Cynthia Arrington, and I live in D6 in Councilmember Taylor's district.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. You know, it's been wonderful listening tonight, and I wanted to know, you know, I am so inspired when I see cross-district collaboration happen in the city. It's so beautiful. And so I want to know, are there some examples that you've seen so far in Oakland where we can emulate working across districts? Because we are one city, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes divided in many ways, whether it be district or congressional districts, right? Depending on tax base and several things. But I'd love to do that, and had the wonderful opportunity to join an organization, SOS Meals on Wheels, where Mary Gregory used to work. And so I am just so happy to be here, and I can't wait to be part of more.
Well, I think that's just a matter of those of you in the community who are already active, reaching out, showing up, just like you're doing tonight, right? And finding out about what's going on in other districts. And I think there's a lot, like I said, we are in a movement time. So there's not a district in this city where there's not some stuff going on. So I mean, it's the perfect time to be focusing on that cross-district collaboration, because there's just a lot of activism going on right now. And I think a lot of people are hungry for it. You're not the only one. You are not the only one. Yeah. So
Definitely echo that. It is definitely a time right now for us to come together. That is a big part of the Redwood Heights Association mission and vision, is to connect and create a connected community that extends past our zip code, all zip codes, and is truly about Oakland coming together for, around, and in regards to community. And so I definitely want to say thank you to everyone that has been out here today joining us. This is one of our several virtual talks, discussions. We will be having another one on April 20th with East Bay Mud. So do check out our Eventbrite page. We just had one most recently, I think a week ago, regarding fire safety. So we try to bring as much information as we can during this time of being, you know, COVID shelter in place, coming out of it, we're ready, but like we still recognize that we need to have ways to build community virtually. And we've been trying to do that all year. And I'm very thankful yet again to all of the board members in the Redwood Heights Association. I see Richard and Mary and Jesse, and I'm sure there were others earlier that I missed, but I thank you all for being a part of what we do to bring community together. Every voice is definitely accepted at the table. So if you would like to volunteer, whether that be helping us on one of our projects like the 39th Street Garden or upcoming Laurel Street Fair when we have a booth and we're giving out maybe some t-shirts, or you know, any of our projects, feel free to check out our website and do email us at info@RHA Oakland, and that's RHA capital O as well, oakland.org. Thank you all so much yet again. Thank you so much, Darlene, for bringing all that information, bringing such a positive spirit to what is, I know for a fact, very hard work. It has been, like I said, something I hold very true and passionate to, close to my heart for the last 10 years here in Oakland. And I know being in service of others is exhausting and exhilarating and challenging and full of bright moments. And so I hope that tonight was a bright moment for you. I know it was a bright moment for us, and we thank you immensely.
You're so welcome. And I do feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to have this career and do this work for so long. And while it's exhausting, it is exhilarating. You've got it right. And it's just a privilege to be able to do this as my life work. So thank you for sharing your time with me this evening.
My pleasure. And as we close out, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I do love this moment of a ruckus of applause for Darlene. So do feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Mary.
This will be available. This recording will be available on Redwood Heights Association's YouTube channel later. So if you want to share it, do feel free to do so. Thank you again. We'll be closing out. Have a wonderful evening. Be well, be safe. Get vaccinated as soon as your name is called.
Bye, Mary.
Good night. Thank you